Hello and welcome. It's great to be with everyone this morning. I'm Susan Solomon. I'm the CEO and founder of the New York Stem Cell Foundation Research Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for a really critical discussion on the issue of unproven and dangerous stem cell therapies. I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar in collaboration with the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University. At NYSCF, we are pioneering stem cell therapies for many conditions. And as hopeful as we all are, myself included, about the power and the promise of stem cell technology for unlocking the secrets of disease, as well as a tool for future, and in some cases, just about to land on the horizon, curative therapies. In recent years, we have seen a huge proliferation of unproven stem cell therapies offered around the world and right here in the US. And there are known and proven stem cell therapies on the market today, most significantly bone marrow transplants that have been transformational for many cancer patients. However, the vast majority of stem cell treatments that are currently marketed for a huge breadth of devastating diseases are not only unproven, which means there's no data to show that they work, but they also can very well be harmful to patients. So we're really at the cusp of truly realizing the promise of stem cells. It seems like a long time, but in fact, this is still a very new field. There are exciting clinical trials underway for many different diseases, including macular degeneration, MS, Parkinson's disease, and others. But there are also unscrupulous providers and clinics, and they are preying on patients and their families with these unsafe and even harmful therapies. So before we dive in, I want to acknowledge and thank the transformative partnership of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation in making events like today's possible and encouraging others to support our efforts. And to all of our visionary partners who are watching today, we're very grateful to you. Our research and discoveries continue to be fueled by your philanthropic support. And for those of you who are new to NYSCF, we look forward to sharing more of our work with you and hope that you'll join us in our mission of accelerating cures for patients everywhere. We truly have an all-star lineup of expert panelists for today's webinar. I hope you will take full advantage by using the chat feature to ask any questions you have as we move through the discussion. We have saved time at the end where we will address as many questions as possible. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome back Dr. Jeffrey Kahn. Jeff is the Andreas Dracopoulos Director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics and Professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management. He is an esteemed bioethicist focused on the intersection of ethics and health and science policy, including human and animal research ethics, public health, and ethical issues in emerging biomedical technologies. We're so thrilled to have you with us again, Jeff, and to host this event with you.
Thank you, Susan. And I'll just add my thanks to the panel and to the audience for joining, and especially to Susan and colleagues at NYSCF for the collaboration that this event represents, and to say looking forward to more and hopefully together in person soon. So I don't want to say more than that now because I know you're going to introduce the rest of the panel and we'll get into our really interesting and important conversation. So back to you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Jeff. We are thrilled to have Dr. Peter Marks with us. He is the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In layman's terms, Dr. Marks is the top regulator who paves the way to advance regenerative medicines, including stem cell and gene therapies. And most recently, he was the primary architect behind the United States vaccine response to COVID, and we are extremely grateful for all of your efforts these past several years, Peter. I am delighted also to welcome Dr. Timothy Caulfield. Tim is the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy, Professor in the Faculty of Law and School of Public Health, and Research Director at the University of Alberta. Tim is an expert in legal policy, ethical issues in medical research, and an outspoken debunker of scientific misinformation, including both around the COVID-19 pandemic and unproven stem cell clinics. And he's also a best-selling author and host and co-producer of a TV series, A User's Guide to Cheating Death. And I'm very happy to welcome back NYSCF's own Dr. Valentina Fossati. Valentina is a senior research investigator here at the NYSCF Research Institute, where she heads our MS and other neuro programs, including pioneering techniques to convert patient cells into all of the major brain cell types, with a goal of enabling drug discovery as well as cell replacement therapies. As both a patient and a researcher, Valentina is committed to ensuring legitimate stem cell therapies advance while combating misinformation about stem cells and stem cell research. So this is an incredible group, and I think we should dive right into the discussion. I'd like to ask Valentina if you could just briefly introduce us to the different types of stem cells, and then Peter, the process of bringing a stem cell therapy to patients.
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone. So, as I think everybody knows that our body has a remarkable regenerative capacity, and not all the tissues, but we are all familiar with the regeneration of our blood. We can all have injuries and lose a certain amount of blood without really having major side effects. And we can actually donate blood regularly without any problem. And why is this? Because the cells that are inside our blood are constantly replenished by a reservoir of cells that are called, stem cells that are found inside the bone, in the spongy part of the bone that is called bone marrow. And these cells are constantly making new blood cells. And so you hear very often about bone marrow stem cells, or they're also called hematopoietic stem cells. And again, this niche of cells stays as we grow, even as we become older. They keep staying inside our body, and that's why we call them adult stem cells. So you can hear about adult hematopoietic stem cells or blood stem cells or bone marrow stem cells. Inside the bone marrow, there is also another population of stem cells, which is called mesenchymal stem cells. They are also found inside the adipose tissue. So you hear about adipose stem cells and in the cord blood or placenta. And unfortunately, these are the cells that most commonly are found and sold as an unlicensed product by some clinics. These cells are found, they stay inside us as adult cells. And then in the past 15 years, we also have learned to make in a dish stem cells. And this is called induced pluripotent stem cells. And this is like really the most recent discovery, where we can now take a few drops of blood from a patient and turn it into a stem cells. And then, as Susan was saying, for example, my work is to make them turn them into brain cells, but we can virtually turn them into any type of cells that we want in the body. And so we said before, that there are some now proven therapies that are using blood stem cells to replace the blood cells when those are wrong in many cancer, like in many leukemia. But besides the use of the bone marrow transplantation, there are several clinical trials ongoing that are testing other potential of the adult stem cells.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Peter, the process of actually taking a stem cell and getting it, approved and making sure it's safe and getting it into a person, if you could walk through that, because I think there's a lot of misinformation around that.
Yeah. So let me start by backing up and helping to understand how we end up with as much confusion that there is, because the FDA looks to regulate things at the least burdensome, in some ways, way we can. Now that's a device term, but we do that for other products. We want to put the least hassle factor on people when we're regulating things that keeps products safe, right? So the ultimate goal here is to make sure that products are safe and that medical products are also effective, and to do so in a way that requires people to jump through only the hoops that are really necessary. So for certain stem cell products, like when one is taking a bone marrow from one individual and giving it to another as part of a related stem cell transplant, there's a very low level of regulation there. In fact, we do not require, we don't get involved with that. And because of those types of exceptions, there's sometimes some confusion that because we have exceptions for certain things that don't require the full type of study that needs to be done for a biologic product, people think that products might fall into that class. There is a set of regulations called the tissue regulations, which categorize certain products that are minimally manipulated, that are used in the same manner in the recipient as in the donor, and that aren't mixed with other products, to not require the kind of demonstration of safety and efficacy that normal biologic products, such as manipulated stem cells, do require. So for stem cells that are harvested and then grown in culture or treated with enzymes, like many of the products that are being given today, those require the normal development process, which generally requires that someone come into the FDA and file what's called an investigational new drug application. That has the information that shows how the product is produced, what data support that it might be safe to use in humans, and what protocols, how is it going to be studied in humans. And then that study is conducted with input from the FDA after it's given the go-ahead. And ultimately, the data are brought back to FDA in a license application. And then hopefully, if everything goes well, something gets an approval. That's the normal process that things should go through. And unfortunately, you can see that if you have to go through the burden of doing the work studying a product systematically, that's a lot more work than if you can just say, oh, my product's accepted from this and I can just go ahead and sell it. And that's why there is this interesting tension in this stem cell area, because this categorization as to whether you are something that requires a study under an investigation new drug application and a biologics license is a self-determination. So some people self-determine in a manner that leaves them on the wrong side of our regulations.
So I have a question, and then I want to actually expand this to really understanding what stem cell tourism, how it's evolved. But there are a lot of people who oppose animal studies, and they raise the question of, well, the FDA is always requiring animal studies, and in fact, animals often, which is true, don't get the diseases that we're trying to fix. So I know the FDA is has been looking at that issue of when animal studies are critical and when they're not. But there seems to be a lot of confusion about that feeds into the general confusion.
Yeah, we very much buy into the idea that for animal studies, we want to use all of the good practices of essentially the 3 R's. We try to minimize the use of animals in testing, and reduce the use and as much as possible. That said, sometimes it's necessary to make sure that products are going to be safe when administered to a human. And the general principle here is that if something needs to be done to make sure that a product will not harm a human, it's acceptable to test it humanely in an animal. Now, in some cases, we don't need to test things in animals because we have either cell-based systems that replace animal testing, or because there's enough data in the literature to say that when somebody is undertaking something, previous studies support that work. So we're not hard and fast about the fact that everything that comes through our door will need its own animal testing. Sometimes it's just not necessary because there's previous data available, or because data in cell culture can substitute for it.
Great. Well, that's extremely helpful. So one of the things that that I think we've seen and been concerned about is stem cell tourism, which has evolved from something that people primarily went abroad to get. And now we're seeing clinics and indeed legitimate hospitals, offering, extensive, stem cell therapies. And so I'd like to hear Jeff and Tim, if you can weigh in as well, to kind of how did we get here? And then also, what are some of the adverse events that we've seen from these therapies, Peter? I mean, this is not something that people are worried about because it's as safe as a walk in the park.
Well,
I would ask that question at Tim. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Tim is the expert in this crowd in terms of the stem cell tourism question. So I would defer to him first. I'll follow.
Yeah, sure. It is a fascinating evolution. I've been really following it, Jeff, as you've noted, right from the start. I think we started studying stem cell tourism around 2005. And Susan, you are exactly right. When it started, it was largely people leaving the United States, leaving Canada, leaving the UK, and going to particular jurisdictions like China, Ukraine, Russia, Mexico, the Caribbean. These were where the clinics resided. And the selling point was they were leveraging the excitement around stem cells, the legitimate excitement around stem cells, to sell entirely unproven therapies. And as Peter knows, and sometimes they're leveraging the idea that, the FDA is a bureaucratic nightmare. They're dragging their feet, and, this should be available in your country. Come to our clinic. And often, as everyone knows on this panel, these were for serious conditions, right? ALS, paralysis, stroke, autism, dementia. So it was a really, I think, a horrific practice, and that continues. That hasn't gone away. But what we've really seen, Susan, as you've noted, is over the last 10 years or so, we've seen an incredible growth of domestic clinics. So in the United States, in Canada, UK, and in fact, there was a study that came out very recently. My colleague Lee Turner publishes. I think he put it almost 3,000 clinics. It was the 2,700 clinics in the United States. Now, these clinics are often focused more on things like orthopedics, on sports injuries in general, on anti-aging, on cosmetic procedures, but they're still offering unproven therapies. Now, the other trend, and I'd love to hear Jeff and Peter's comments on this. The other trend that you see is very creative marketing around this stuff in order to sort of get around the FDA. So we're seeing a lot of testimonials, right? That's often a very common. In fact, we did a study with my colleague Zubin Master did a terrific study where he looked at the degree to which it really is about testimonials, marketing this stuff. That's a red flag, by the way. Whenever it's an anecdote, testimonial, narrative, that's not great data. The other big trend that we've seen is these seminars. They'll hold these seminars and have people come hear about stem cell therapy. So it's not this overt advertising that will necessarily, and I defer, of course, to Peter, trigger a quick FDA response, but we're definitely seeing that. And then, of course, the other thing, something we study really carefully at the Institute, is how this is being portrayed in pop culture. You are seeing, for example, sports stars, they're just talking about getting their PRP for their knee so they can be ready to go. And that's covered in the sports page. We call this implicit hype, because the goal maybe isn't necessarily to hype the therapy and to suggest it's efficacious, but holy cow, that's the takeaway, right? So if you're sitting at home, you got a bad knee, you hear about your favorite running back getting PRP or stem cell therapy, it seems more legitimate. I call it science exploitation, right? Taking real, exciting science and using it to market bunk. And unfortunately, this trend is continuing.
Well, I think it's really important, Tim, because your characterization of kind of all of this kind of soft hype is it's extraordinary. And it's, whether it's your neighbor, certainly if it's your sports star, your team of choice, it's going to have incredible influence.
If I just jump in, another really good example is crowdfunding. So we're seeing, there's been some really interesting studies. A colleague of mine, Jeremy Schneider from SFU, did a really interesting study where he looked at crowdfunding for unproven stem cell therapies, right? And this is a very powerful form of marketing because it's patients speaking to patients, right? I need money to get this unproven therapy that the FDA won't let me get. And if you have the same condition as that person who's trying to raise money, first of all, it's horrible that they're using crowdfunding to raise money for an unproven therapy. That's another topic we can talk about, but it's also a form of marketing for that therapy, right? So there are all these subtle forms of marketing that are making this space really complicated.
Jeff, do you want to?
Sure. I'm trying to think how to connect some dots here, but I want to maybe even invoke something that Valentina said at the very beginning of our conversation. So the term stem cells covers lots of territory, right? We've heard everything from bone marrow to hematopoietic stem cells. Now we're talking about platelet-rich plasma. And so part of the challenge here is the category is overbroad and, lots of things fall into it. Among the kind of, to me, interesting things that have happened is even in the, the bone marrow space, cord blood collection and storage has, I think, been a kind of factor here where that's legitimate, right, therapy, but it has been opportunistically, I think, used as a way to get people to pay money to store something for their potential future use. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's a kind of a real therapy that's now been turned into kind of a business. So that's a kind of funny little, maybe an early beginning point here that launched the playbook, as it were. So that's one observation to make. The second, and this will come back to something Peter said, and so maybe I'll pitch over to him in a second. The story here is there's a kind of set of therapies that fall between the policy and regulatory cracks, right? It isn't like the FDA said there's no reason to regulate these things. It's that it just doesn't kind of fit the typical model, which is also the story of reproductive technology, right? Which doesn't see the kind of regulation of other things that the FDA regulates for reasons that Peter can better explain than I can. But that's important because there's a much longer history of reproductive technology tourism. And so it's sort of an easy path to say, well, look, we know how this works. It's a very lucrative area. And in fact, what's going on in Ukraine has totally upset the reproductive tourism market because Kyiv was such a hotspot for that, interestingly, and not in a good way, interesting. But the point is that's many decades more mature. And so it's sort of easy to say, aha, we know how this works in this other area that's lightly regulated. And so it's just an easy application of what has been that history, I think, to this other area, which, also lightly regulated and has the added problem of not working, unproven, at least a reproductive technology, depending on what we're talking about, but at least IVF and, sort of mainline technologies, they do work. It's just cheaper to go to Kyiv than it is to go to New York City. So anyway, I think all of that to me is part of the reason we're in the place we are in this particular conversation.
Well, we also, on that note, there's something called mitochondrial replacement therapy, which was developed here and in the UK, but really advanced here. But the FDA is really prevented, is my understanding, from even considering because of legislation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how does so we now have a situation where we have something that actually is some could argue a superior potential therapy, but we're not able to offer it in the US, so people go abroad. But I think what we're really trying to parse out here is this kind of minimal manipulation, right? Isn't that kind of the technical, Peter, way a lot of this is avoided? Perhaps you could speak to that. And I know, Valentina, also, I think you've encountered that in looking at different therapies, including MS.
Yeah, so what people sometimes try to do is they try to say that doing certain things make that product fall within the tissue regulations, which means they don't have to come in for any type of pre-license review. That basically means they can go directly to marketing the product, just maintaining certain precautions to prevent infectious disease transmission. Some of them don't even do that, but that's another story. The issue there is that the way you say you're going to meet this is by trying to say that what you're doing is not actually making a significant change to the cells that you harvest. And so there are people that argue with us over whether putting cells in culture and letting them divide over the course of weeks is more than minimally manipulated or not. We in our laboratories have been able to show very definitively that once you let cells divide in culture, and they're once they're in that lovely incubator outside of the body, they are no longer, they start to change properties. And so our feeling is that if those things like incubating them to have them grow, or for that matter, when you have to treat cells with enzymes in order to then use them because you've destroyed certain other cells in a population, that's also more than minimally manipulated. But some would, again, try to claim that that's not. And so we get into issues where people claim that the product they have falls outside of the requirement for study under an investigational new drug application or biologics license application. And it leads to this awkward situation where there are people marketing products that are actually, they are not legally marketed, at least in the United States.
Thank you, Peter. Valentina, do you have any specific examples or things that you've come across?
Yeah, no, I really think it's good to bring the example of multiple sclerosis, which is actually a great example of how good science and rigorously controlled clinical trials are bringing now to wonderful promises. There are some people that are affected by multiple sclerosis that are not really responding to any of the therapies that are available. They keep having an active disease. And for these people, has been tried over the past 2 decades, more than 2 decades now, this bone marrow transplantation. So you take out their own bone marrow cells. It's autologous transplantation because it's your own cells, and then you put them back. And by doing this process, there is a reset of the immune cells that are inside the blood. And somehow this is really making the new blood cells that are formed not longer attacking the cells in the brain. And so these patients, there are remarkable data now from these clinical trials that the patients are stable. They no longer have new lesions. But this is, this has been, it took many decades and several different trials, because The procedure is also involving a strong regimen, so chemotherapy. So when you take out the cells, you actually have to destroy everything else that is left inside. And so this has really strong side effects. Sometimes very severe, can also be fatal, and so it has to be really controlled and performed in clinics, and it takes a long time. It's a very long procedure, which is why despite these remarkable results, this is not yet a first-line treatment. Can only be done by leveraging patient by patient and case by case, which are the side effects, if it's worthy to do it. In the case of multiple sclerosis, there are also studies done with mesenchymal stem cells. And in this case, again, there have been clinical trials. Phase 1 studies have been completed, which is the phase where you look at the safety. And I think we all agree it's safe to say that they are safe. They didn't show particular problems, but it's still early to understand the second part, which is how efficient they are. There are preliminary data suggesting that they can work with some particular patients, but it's still very early. And as a patient also, I really understand how much we would like things to be working today. We don't want to wait 10 years. But these procedures really take time, because this journey, it's a very long journey that before to go through the entire procedure, it takes much time, and the science cannot be done in a day. So before we are collecting enough statistical data from enough number of patients, so we can clearly say if a therapy works or not, it takes a decade, which is why we should be very grounded and cautious when something, as we said before, anecdotally, oh, it worked in one person. That unfortunately does not mean that is safe for everyone, because as we know, we are all very much different, and we all respond very different to treatments.
Well, I think that kind of raises the question of, the patients, are desperate for access.
Yeah.
But we need to run trials. There's something I think that has confused a lot of people, and perhaps it's emboldened some of the stem cell tourism, which is we have something now called right to try. I in this field still find right to try confusing. So I think it would be helpful to just talk about what this right to try is, because it really is, it's kind of a broad effort of patients saying, it's my body, I'm suffering from whatever it is, and I should have a right to try X. But that isn't a license to go and just use all of these illegitimate therapies. Peter, do you want to speak to right to try and kind of what that is?
I can basically describe what right to try is. We try to keep our hands off of right to try as much as possible. This was something that was put forward a few years ago with this concept that people who are without other possibilities for therapy should have the right to try whatever is out there. What was eventually agreed upon as part of right to try is that for something to be eligible to be used as part of right to try, which means that it can be used without informed consent, not on a clinical trial, not under any kind of FDA oversight, it does need to be a product that is under IND, investigation new drug application with FDA, and it needs to be past phase 1. In other words, it has to at least be shown to have been safe, and generally it should be somewhere in the course of further study after that initial safety study. So those are the products that qualify, and the determination then is within the patient's physician. It's outside. We don't get involved in these And in fact, basically, it's a matter between the patient, the provider, and the company about getting this. We don't have any, in other words, we don't see any paperwork on these. It's outside of that process. And that was put in place ostensibly because some didn't feel that the existing expanded access programs or individual treatment programs were broad enough.
Perhaps they just needed a new name.
That's part of the problem, right?
So
It's-
Jeff, yeah. What do you
Well, I
think?
would just say, I mean, what Peter said is all accurate. The challenge is people understand things like compassionate use and expanded access and early access to drugs in clinical trial as all kind of living under right to try and as a general term, but right to try is a very specific meaning. And so that's part of the confusion, I think. And so, you know, all of those things have somewhat different definitions: compassionate use, expanded access, early access, but all of them are about people getting access to things that aren't yet fully approved to be sold as approved medicines. And so that's, I think, the idea. Now, why, and often it's people who are quite desperate. So this plays into this problem of, potential exploitation. It's a little less problematic in the right to try space because it has to be something under IND, as Peter has said. So it isn't just sort of Wild West free for all, like some of the things we're talking about related to unproven, stem cell therapies.
If I could comment real quickly on right to try, it is, we're seeing this movement all around the world too. It's not just in the United States,
Right.
but it does create some policy and public perception problems, because I think it does play, and Peter, we keep mentioning your name because you're at the FDA, but it does play to that perception that the FDA is this bureaucracy kind of withholding efficacious treatments from the public, right? Which clinics can leverage when they're marketing unproven stem cell therapies. So I think it builds on that myth, that misunderstanding what the FDA is actually trying to do. I think it also can be used to legitimize unproven therapies. And the other thing that's really important, and I think Valentina talked about this when she just now, is, usually, despite public perception, something when it's in a clinical trial, it usually doesn't make it to the clinical application. And if it does make it to the clinical application, it is usually less efficacious than earlier promise. And then a lot of studies on this, and I guess it depends on the field, and you guys can all comment. And it hovers around 10% if you're in a clinical trial actually making it to the clinic. But the right to try kind of portray it like, often you see it as like, this is effective. It just hasn't jumped through those regulatory hurdles. You have a right of access to it, and that kind of vibe can also feed the market for unproven stem cell therapies.
Yeah, can I just jump in here, because as a hematologist oncologist who treated a lot of, and my specialty was treating leukemia patients and treating a lot of people with advanced leukemia. I'm very aware of what people think when they're getting an investigational therapy. And even when we use investigational therapies that are fully consistent with the FDA regulations, when people hear this, they generally have very optimistic ideas about what's going to come to them. And unfortunately, this is an issue that can occur here, is when you choose to take a therapy, particularly paying for that therapy, which is actually different than the investigational therapies that we're generally talking about. When we're talking about ones being studied as part of clinical investigations, people have an expectation, and that expectation may not match up with reality here. As exactly as you said, that the chance that these things can be effective is often 10% might be good in some cases.
Yeah, there's also, part of the challenge here is that heart-rending stories often are used to justify broad policy. So, a very sick child for whom the only therapy that could possibly work is something that's in a trial. and the family wants access to it, and they don't survive, and then it's pointed to as a problem, like the process is too slow, and it's denying life-saving care to people who need it, and so, sort of like law, like bad, really dramatic cases make for bad law, and it's sort of that, I think, a version of that drove the right to try movement, and I think we're seeing some of those consequences.
Just to make it clear that the individual patient expanded access requests that FDA gets, we grant 99% of them. You can go to the website. If you search up individual patient expanded access and FDA, you'll come to the website. We grant 99% of those, and the paperwork has been greatly streamlined for those. So that it's really, these are generally a page. I know at least in our center, the Center for Biologics, we generally respond to emergency requests within hours and maximum a day. So we're trying to deal with that piece of it. But you're right, it's the perception and it's true, some of this might be there from years past, but it's certainly not the case anymore.
Well, and the last thing about that is the companies don't love this, right? Because it's easy for you to say, sure, go ahead as the FDA, but the company then has to provide this, thing that could be very expensive for them to larger numbers of people outside of the process that allows them to collect data to submit back to the regulator. So it's a very complicated picture, and it's not just the patient's family, FDA involved, it's the companies that are producing these therapeutics.
Can you just briefly explain expanded access? What for everyone who's watching?
Right. So this actually dates back to the time of the HIV epidemic starting, when it became clear that sometimes drugs came around where before they made it through the full course of study, which can take years, there was enough evidence to suggest that they could bring benefit to people. And so in its wisdom, eventually, Congress came around and FDA made regulations around the area of allowing access for small populations of patients to larger populations of patients when there was some evidence that someone might benefit. So for a single patient, for a single individual, we actually require very little information to show that something might be of benefit. We do need to know that the product is going to be made in a safe manner to administer to humans. And we'd like to have, at the very least, good preclinical evidence and preferably some clinical evidence that it will bring benefit. And then we would consider whether it could be used based on the seriousness of the disease being addressed. But as I said, 99% of the time we say go ahead. There are then larger populations. There's something called an intermediate size treatment protocol where sometimes there might be something that might have made it to phase 2 in development, and there might be certain populations of patients that are excluded from clinical trials. And so this is a way of making the product available. For instance, I'm just going to make this up. So a product is being studied, but an exclusion is that you can't have abnormal kidney function. Well, but it's true that it's a potentially life-saving product, and some people with abnormal kidney function might benefit. There can be an expanded access protocol for people who have abnormal kidney function for that product. So it's a way of making it available more widely. And as I say, in general, we say yes to these in large part because it is a patient focus, and as long as we're confident that it will be safe or reasonably safe, we go ahead.
Thank you. So what can people do to figure out if what they're being offered is a legitimate stem cell therapy? What kind of questions can they ask? And what are the warning signs? Who'd like to?
I'll take a shot at that. First of all, it's getting really difficult. It's getting really difficult. We put a group together not long ago to sort of map out that exact question, Susan. And the problem is so many clinics are now using what I call tokens of legitimacy. So they'll have you go to the website and it looks very spectacular and it looks very, very legit. There'll be a lot of people with white coats and holding up beakers, and they'll talk about their impressive board. That's a token of legitimacy that have really impressive names associated with it. They'll talk about a clinical trial that they're doing, and they might even register that clinical trial. And who knows, what it is? It might just be asking patients questions. But it looks impressive, right? They'll refer to publications, maybe fantastic work that Valentina's doing that isn't really related to what they're offering, but it kind of gives that veneer of credibility to it. All of those things are problematic. The other thing they'll refer to is something often called predatory journals, where they'll publish something that makes it seem legitimate, but it was just a publication that they basically purchased. So those are all tokens of legitimacy that are making it more difficult. But what you can still do is, are they referring to the body of evidence on the topic? So that's really important. So what does the body of evidence say about how efficacious this is? Are they relying on testimonials almost entirely? That's a big red flag. Is it about testimonials? Of course, FDA approval is really important, but I think we're talking about things that are skating around that FDA approval. Testimonials really, really important. Are they claiming that the stem cells can treat a whole bunch of different things? That's not the way medicine works, right, guys? I mean, it's if it can cure everything from your wrinkles to MS, that's a huge red flag. So any kind of promise of a really impressive results should be questioned, because again, science, unfortunately, medicine often doesn't work that way. And the other thing, and this is sort of a depressing recommendation, and it refers to something you said right off the top, Susan. There isn't a lot available right now. There isn't a lot available that has good clinical data to support it. So the first red flag is, are they offering something that has to do with stem cells? That should make you skeptical right off the top.
I guess to add, I mean, everything Tim said is exactly right. I would say, what to do. I mean, that was you listed a whole bunch of things that, it's really hard to work your way through that if you're a consumer, a patient. And so I would only add, talk to someone you trust who has knowledge. That to me seems like the one really important thing to say. Someone who's got a healthcare professional status who you trust, ask them.
Peter, your thoughts on this, on how to tell?
Yeah, I think it can be very practical, which is that, I think in some ways, if what someone is getting, in general, if somebody is getting stem cells that are being significantly manufactured, and the way to tell that is if they're going into an incubator, somebody's harvesting them from you and they got to send them off someplace, so you get them back some other day, or if they got to go to a processing lab, it's probably that. You probably either should be getting, you probably should be having to sign an informed consent form, and you might even ask, do you have a protocol with the FDA? And actually, the other red flag about this is, are you paying for this? Because if you are paying for this or being charged, it should be an approved product. Or if not, someone should be able to explain to you why they're able to market it to you, because it's oh, well, here's the FDA authorization. You see, here's the package insert, right? Because if you were a person with lymphoma and you were getting, someone said they wanted to give you a CAR T-cell therapy, they'd be able to say, oh yeah, can you show me the package insert? They'd be able to come out with a package insert for any one of the several approved CAR T-cells for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and say, here's what we're going to give you. They should be able to do the same thing if they're charging you for it, or if they're trying to charge your insurance for it. If they can't, and they're asking you for money for it, something might be up. I'm not saying it's always may not always be wrong, but you need to, the kind of red flags are you going to get charged? Should you be signing informed consent? And is there a protocol? Those are the kinds of things I would look for.
So one of the questions we have actually is from an RN who has received a seminar invitation for an orthopedic stem cell therapy. Now that's another form of marketing. This person is asking, how can they, because it's also gone to a lot of their patients, how can they protect their patients from these sort of unproven therapies? And I presume this is more of the kind of PRP, the situation where, they might not send your blood off, but they certainly would, draw the blood, take it in the back, do whatever they do, spin it around in a centrifuge and put it back.
Yeah, so PRP is a really difficult one because it's not even a cellular therapy. It's actually a biologic product that even falls out of this whole. It's a whole other problem that can occur. And in some cases, there again, PRP in some cases becomes a complex regulatory categorization. But again, asking the questions is the right thing to do.
So if we know that these groups or institutes are offering stem cell treatments that are not legitimate, what is the action to take?
Well,
Don't go there. Don't spend your money.
I'll start off as I think there are a couple different actions. First, we have you can get on the FDA website and you can send an email or a complaint question, and we will investigate those. Another thing, though, that has been very effective, more effective in some ways than we have been, is by reporting it to the state boards of health. Because the state boards of health have taken a dim view of defrauding patients. So for us, we have to go in and make a legal case about the safety, efficacy, manufacturing issues. In some cases, state boards of medicine have been able to go in and say, wait a second, you're charging a patient for an unproven therapy, and they've been able to take action that way. And so either way, I think you shouldn't, the best defense here is information. So ask questions yeah, exactly. I like the sign. There we go. Ask questions. And then if you really are concerned, you can send us an email. You can go to the state, your state board of health or state board of medical examiners and report or ask. If it's legit, what I have found generally in my years as a regulator is legitimate operators don't mind when FDA comes sniffing around, because you know what, they actually want to do the right thing, and they're very happy to work collaboratively with us, because they know that we're not there to do gotcha. We're there to actually just make sure that the public health is maintained. Whereas those who are doing interesting practices, they don't like to see us. So, I mean, I think, again, information is your friend.
Well, speaking of which, I'd like to ask all of our panelists for final thoughts, but also resources. Any good websites out there that people can turn to? I know this is something that the large international stem cell organization ISSCR has taken on. Again, they don't have a good housekeeping list of approved stem cell therapies for many reasons, including the litigation costs would be incredible. But it is one effort. I'm sure there are many others to help people understand, you know, when they're in pain, when they're being told you have to have knee surgery and they don't want to have knee surgery. And, you know, their neighbor Fred went to XYZ and, you know, had this therapy and now, you know, they're running marathons. You know, they need to have a way to evaluate things. So, Tim?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with this fantastic panel. It's a really important topic. I think this is a complex problem, and we're going to have to come at it from absolutely every direction. FDA, FTC, so truth in advertising stuff. Absolutely, the licensing boards have got to clamp down on their members. You know, Peter, I actually like to see them do more. You know, more, please. We also need to get on social media and debunk this stuff. So I held up the sign and I really meant it, right? You know, debunking does work. You know, let's get out there and let's have entities, you know, highlight what the science actually says. The ISSCR has a great website that they can go to that has, you know, really basic information about what's available and what to look for on these websites. But I agree with Peter. More information about what really works, and I'd like to see now. The FDA, I think, that did this out of the gate. They put out, you know, warnings about about unproven stem cell therapies. It wasn't like they were doing a regulatory response. It was just like a FYI to the universe about unproven stem cell therapies. I'd love to see more of that. You know, about PRP, about other kinds of things that aren't working, and just watch the hype, you guys. I'm sure Valentina would agree with me. If there was something out there and it was super efficacious, I promise you'd know.
Thank you, Valentina. Yes, I mean, I just want to talk to the patients that are listening to us today. You know, when you are affected by a disease, or even worse, when your children are affected by a disease, you completely lose your rationality. So what Jeff said before, you know, hurry, but don't rush. Don't take a decision by yourself. You certainly cannot. You're not able to think. You need to trust your doctor. Always work with a doctor that has followed you through the disease, or with somebody else that you trust, that knows, that is in the field. So ask, don't rush. Ask for different opinions, and as was just said, if something is there and is working, for sure, you know, few more people will be able to tell you, yes, this is an approved treatment, this works. So be very cautious. I know it's hard, and only when you are in that situation you can experience it, but that's why you need to have, you know, help from people that you trust.
So Jeff, I'm going to ask you to close, but before that, Peter, do you have anything else you want to add?
I think what Valentina just said is, I just would echo that this, just ask the questions that you need. And if somebody can't answer them to your satisfaction, then you have to ask elsewhere. I in the chat put our website that has some questions to ask, etc. But thanks, and thank you again for having me today, having us.
We could go on for much longer. Jeff.
I'll just say thanks to everybody, because I know we're at top of the hour, but really wonderful conversation. Valentina, Peter, Tim, and most of all, Susan, thank you all. It's been really great, lovely collaboration. As always, look forward to more.
Lots more to discuss. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Be safe.